Hey everyone, you are listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast. We are two neurodivergent mental health professionals in a neurotypical world. I'm Patrick Casale.
And I'm Dr. Neff.
And during these episodes, we do talk about sensitive subjects, mental health, and there are some conversations that can certainly feel a bit overwhelming. So we do just want to use that disclosure and disclaimer before jumping in. And thanks for listening. Hey everyone, welcome back to Divergent Conversations. Megan and I are joined today by Emily Kircher-Morris, LPC, is the host of the Neurodiversity podcast, which explores the psychological, educational, and social needs for enriching the lives of neurodivergent people. She is the author of several books for parents and educators related to the development of children and teens who are neurodivergent and cognitively gifted. She started her career in education and now works as a mental health counselor in private practice outside of St. Louis, Missouri. And she specializes in neurodivergent, twice exceptional, and gifted people of all ages. Emily, thanks for being on here and starting us off with this series.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So we are starting a new series on giftedness, and I can't think of a better guest to have us on. To have us on. That's an interesting flip. To have on our podcast to help us kind of define some of the language, get the lay of the land, because I'm seeing giftedness talked about a lot and talked about, is this a form of neurodivergence? There's a lot of questions around it. So I guess to start us off, can we just get some anchoring concepts on the table? Like, I'm curious, I've seen a few different definitions of giftedness. Like, how do you define giftedness? Do you conceptualize this as a form of neurodivergence?
hmm So, I guess let me ask you this. So, are intellectual disabilities a type of neurodivergence?
I think so. I mean, yes, I think so in the sense of if we think about the bell curve,
Mm-hmm.
and then if you're diverging from normative in a significant way, then yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, if that's the case, then I would argue that cognitive giftedness is also a type of neurodivergence. It's just on the other end of that bell curve, and I think that so I came from the education, world, like Patrick mentioned in the intro. And I started out, I was a classroom teacher, and then I taught in gifted ed programs. And so when I entered the mental health field, that was kind of my background where I came from. And even throughout the 20 plus years that I've been doing this, my understanding of giftedness really has evolved. And I think that there's a lot of different ways that things have shifted just as part of the neurodiversity movement. So,
Sure.
so when we talk about giftedness, I think what most people think about is they think of an IQ test. Like,
hmm
you say you've got the 𝗿𝗲𝘀𝘀liche tests, the scales, or the 𝗹𝗶𝘀𝘀𝘁𝗋, which is old and
hmm
outdated, but it's around. Or there's some others that schools use. And primarily they think about education. They think about because it's an identification that is used in the school setting. However, it's not a clinical label
Right.
in the way that
Right. Like I would never diagose someone with a gifted. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right.
I think
Although
that's a
you
really
might
important.
recognize that as part of their profile.
When I do an IQ test, I might
Right.
say your IQ is in this range. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
So what's interesting is there's not really an agreed upon cutoff score if that's the only criteria that we're looking at. So depending on who you're talking to, some people would say the top 10% of ability in cognitive scores. Some people would say top 5%. Some people would say it's top 2. And so that kind of varies from place to place, but there really is no agreed upon cut score specifically there. And for what it's worth, that's probably best because a score on one test is very difficult to really define what somebody's overall
Mhm.
ability is. So that's one way to conceptualize this. It is also often associated with performance, so
Mhm.
academic performance. But when you dig into that a little bit deeper, there are many people who are very intelligent, who are very bright, who don't perform academically very, very, very
Right.
well. And so, when we're trying to figure out, what does this really mean? There are some certain strengths that we often see with people who kind of qualify under that cognitively gifted piece. And it has to do with problem solving, abstract reasoning, often language, skills as far as communication. And just like other types of neurodivergence, you can actually look from a neurobiological perspective and see differences in the brain. So, for example, brain volume literally is correlated with increased IQ scores. And so bigger brains, it has to do with more ability in that area. But it's also complicated by external pieces. So there's a study that was released recently that talks about how they can actually predict IQ at age 18 by doing MRI studies at something like 6 months, 18 months, and 3 years. They kind of did this.
Oh my goodness.
It's predictive. And it has to do with the theta brainwaves. And specifically for theta brainwaves, the slower they are associated with a higher cognitive score. And that has to do with your stress levels. Well, you know what? One of the things is that increases the theta brainwaves in your brain is trauma, for example. And so then, but that is also then correlated with reduced cognitive scores. So it is neurobiological in origin in many ways, but is definitely impacted environmentally
by environment. Yeah.
And so it's kind of one of these both and situations.
That there's obviously a genetic component, but also the environment will play in. It's really interesting. Yeah, I appreciate you walking us through that. I think my confusion has been, so I come from, the psychological tradition, so definitely have administered many IQ tests. And I definitely, even though IQ tests, I feel like it's an important disclaimer, IQ tests, like we know that there are some bias around any of these tests, but especially there's a lot of groups that these don't capture intellect well. But that is the framework I'm coming from. So like I've always thought like, okay, I've heard different cutoffs, whether it's an IQ of 140 or 150. But and so I'm not gifted, which is interesting because my kids are both gifted and my spouse is gifted, but I'm not.
Let me throw out a statistic.
Okay.
So for what it's worth, research shows that people tend to find partners who have an IQ score within about a 10-point range of their own.
Well, I punched up then because my spouse's IQ is like, I think 140, 145, and I've got a 115 I'm working with. But partly my working memory and my processing speed brings it all down. So yeah, I married up.
My wife is going to love hearing this. Because I think my IQ test registered at like 148 when I did it. So she's going to really love that. And I would imagine that. And I've said this to Megan before, like if we're using cutoff as just IQ, I always feel like I'm punching up above my weight with Megan on this podcast. So like, it's really interesting when we stop just using the IQ demarcation to determine that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to agree with, and recognizing that, like, here's something that's interesting. So how many IQ tests do people usually take in their lifetime? Maybe one, maybe a couple, perhaps, if they're being assessed. Usually it's when they're in school, if you're looking for a specific learning disability, or if you're looking for, or if they go through a psych assessment of some type. But usually many people don't ever take an IQ test. What's interesting about those really high scores, so Patrick, for what it's worth, so when I was tested in school, mine was probably right around that same range where yours is at that time. But you know how we talk about that Flynn effect, which is that regression towards the mean, which to many people out there who are listening, they're probably going, I have no idea what that is. That's okay. Here's the best way to explain it. Basically, what they say is when you have somebody who tests in any particular area, and they are an outlier, very, very high or very, very low, what you would expect if they are retested is that score would regress towards the mean or the average. So it would come down. So it's kind of like saying, when I went and took my IQ test when I was in second grade, and I scored, 147 or whatever, it's like hitting a hole in one. the next time you would take that test, if you would take it again, it would be very unlikely that I would hit that hole in one again. And so my score would probably be closer to the mean. And so when we're talking about any of these scores, it's kind of this very vague, ambiguous thing in many ways. And the other thing I will say is that there are 1,000,001 reasons why somebody does poorly on a test like this.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to take all of it with a grain of salt. The gifted ed world, it's interesting, has evolved so much. So we talk about those inequities and those different groups that we have in different populations specifically. Gifted ed really has been grappling with this. So I was actually diagnosed with ADHD when I was a kid, before Asperger's was even added to the DSM. I was never assessed for it. But I was also gifted. But the only reason I had either one of those things is because my mom advocated for me. She was a special education teacher, and she knew. So back in in the early 90s, when I was given that ADHD diagnosis, that was pretty rare.
Yeah.
But typically, the way that you were identified for gifted ed services was that the teachers nominated you. They said, yep, this student seems really smart. Well, who are they going to nominate? They're going to nominate the compliant, highly verbal kids who get all their work turned in on time, and usually kids who are, part of the not marginalized, right? Like, so when you have those groups that are marginalized, we have that implicit bias. We have all of these different pieces that influence us as teachers. So what Gifted Ed did was they came up with the idea of universal screening, meaning that you don't just test the kids that the teachers say to test at several different grade levels, maybe first grade and third grade or whatever. You test everybody in the grade level, looking for the opportunities to find those kids. And what ended up happening is, first of all, it did definitely increase the number of students from marginalized backgrounds who were identified. And in the process, although this wasn't the goal, it also increased the number of twice exceptional people that we were identifying. So twice exceptional is this term that refers to somebody who is both cognitively gifted and has another diagnosis layered on top of that, like autism, like ADHD, like dyslexia, all of these other pieces there. And so all of a sudden you have these kids who are not necessarily the compliant academic achievers who are being identified. But, it's interesting as adults, depending on what career you choose, you tend to find people with some level similar abilities, right? Like depending on where you end up as far as your career goes, just because different levels of ability offer opportunities to succeed in various areas. And so sometimes people don't always realize what a wide range there really can be in that overall ability.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how you broke that down, and also that how I didn't realize that's how 2E became more commonly identified. I've been hearing more and more conversations around 2E. So one question, and then we can move on, and because there's some other things I'm excited to ask you about. But I think some of my confusion has been, and I think mostly on social media, but I'm seeing the term of giftedness expand to be, it feels like more personality, like if you're really curious, if you're existential, and I think those are traits that often are common for those with very high IQs. But that's like, if I looked at, a list of traits, I'd be like, oh yeah, I'm gifted. I have these personality traits, but I don't have the same shared experience of, I've worked with gifted clients. I know there's a different experience that I don't have. So I'm curious, especially because you are coming from education, what do you think of this? Are you seeing that too, this kind of more diffuse term being used around giftedness? And what do you make of that? Because it's confusing me.
So so here's the thing. I'm going to say some things. I come from the gifted ed world, and I might say some things that might be counter what some people think or believe. And for what it's worth,
just as a blanket statement, like so much is evolving in our world right now that like I'll say something maybe that I said last year that I'm like, wow, I would say that so differently this year. So just, I think blanket statement to our listeners, like we are evolving, the language we use is evolving. So absolutely.
Yeah, and we want to embrace that. And in the gifted ed world is a very small bubble. Actually, Megan, you were just on the podcast last week, and we were kind of chatting about this a little bit. And you're like, oh yeah, we're gonna have this guest. It's like I knew all of their names because it's just a small I knew exactly who they were. And so it's just a small world. But sometimes what happens when you have that bubble is you get into a little bit of an echo chamber. And one of the ideas that really caught on in the gifted ed world is this idea about the theory of overexcitabilities. So this comes from, you know,
Not just.
yes, I know.
It starts with a D, and I can't pronounce it. But I just learned this idea, and I really like it.
𝗲𝗶𝘀𝘀cie.
𝗲𝗶𝘀𝘀cie. There we go. Yeah.
And the theory of overexcitabilities specifically is actually the theory of positive disintegration and overexcitabilities. So without getting into the whole theory, one of the areas that is really caught on within the gifted ed world is this theory of overexcitability. So there are these 5 areas that they talk about where gifted individuals have increased sensitivity in these particular areas. So intellectual ability or curiosity, basically intellectual intensity, emotional intensity, imaginational intensity, psychomotor intensity, so like movement. And then the last one is, they call it, it's translated from Polish, it's called sensual, but it really means sensory intensity. So what, you know, and the reason, well, so this has been used to explain some of those qualitative traits of giftedness, like the existential piece that you're describing can come from, you know, kind of that intellectual curiosity piece. But the research is very, very mixed. So one thing that they do for sure know is that gifted individuals do tend to have mild to moderate increased sensory sensitivities. So hypersensitivity. And in my mind, that has to do with like how your brain is wired, how you're interpreting information, but it should not be debilitating. It should not, you know, it's not something that's causing really, you know, distress like you would see with somebody who really has, you know, like a sensory processing.
Like who's autistic. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, it's interesting to figure out like why that caught on so much because
probably because it wasn't an IQ. And so it was like, we could talk about the human and not just this number, which is also so like, I think even people who are gifted have a hard time talking about it because it's like, this is a weird thing to acknowledge about myself. Am I like stroking my ego if I say I'm gifted? So it makes so much sense to me. It caught on. It's like, oh, I can talk about how I'm overexcitable.
Yeah.
And the struggles that come with that without sounding like I'm complaining about having a high IQ.
Right. Exactly. And I think in some ways it's also been used to justify advocacy for gifted ed services in the schools, like, oh, they have to have this. But what I really have found is ultimately there's so much variability with anybody who is gifted, and you can't really find, like, some people will check those boxes. But I also think, for what it's worth, the gifted ed world has a history of being pretty ableist. And, you know, a lot of those traits that I just mentioned, emotional intensity, sensory sensitivities, psychomotor intensity. Okay, well, what does that really sound like? Emotional regulation difficulties, right? You know, sensory sensitivities, obviously, like with the hypo or the hypersensitivity, and hyperactivity is the psychomotor piece, right? Like where I have to be in motion. Okay, so what is the possibility that somebody who has an outlying score on their overall ability might be an outlier in other areas as well? And so they might also be ADHD or be autistic. And what often has happened is that people have liked to explain those things away. Oh, no. They cannot be autistic. They're just gifted quirky, right? Those sensory sensitivities are part of their overexcitability. Whereas
like, it's kind of like HSP, but for giftedness. It's like, let's repackage these traits.
Yes.
Something that's more palpable. Okay.
Absolutely. And for what it's worth, if you look at those 5 areas of overexcitability, they actually align quite well with the Big 5 personality model.
I noticed that. I was intrigued because I love the Big 5. I used to do some Big 5 research.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fascinating. I remember one time, this is actually probably the moment that my little gifted ed bubble got popped, where I was like no longer aware of like how things were so insulated. I was doing a presentation to a group of psychologists about giftedness, and I was talking about the overexcitabilities, and somebody said, oh, well, that sounds like the Big Five personality model. I literally had not heard of it. And it's like, and then I go through and do research. I'm like, oh, I felt really embarrassed that this question was asked, and I really didn't understand that. But when we talk about that ableist history, we talk about this overlap of twice-exceptionality. One of the most fascinating statistics it's like, it's so impactful, and I think we just don't realize it, is that of individuals who are identified as autistic, they're 1.5 times more likely than the general population also to have intelligence in the superior range, meaning that they're more likely to be gifted. So when you have, for example, a group of just people versus a group of people who are identified as gifted, you're going to have more autistic people in that gifted group. And I think that there's a lot of overlap there. And people, I don't know. So I often am so curious because when you look at some of the neurobiological traits of autism compared to giftedness, a lot of it is like about that hyperconnectivity, the different ways that the brain is wired, and there's a lot of similarities there. And I often think that sometimes the further you are outside of the norm, so when like somebody who has an IQ of 125, 130 might be identified as gifted in the schools, and they might be able to operate in the world look pretty normal, I guess, for lack of a better way to phrase that, regardless of masking or whatever else that might be. But the further up you get, 135, 140, 150, there's a lot of overlap there. And I'm so curious to figure out, like, as the science goes forward, is there really, how much of a difference is there? Is it just about how it manifests and how it shows up in the world? Is it just about which traits come to the surface and how disabling some of those traits might be? But it's really interesting to see how that overlap really impacts people.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Yeah. And so I remember learning in my training because and I was learning that when I learned this, it was in a comprehensive assessment classes of a kind of like a caution to not misdiagnose autism. And the idea is that I remember learning is that more, like if someone is gifted, if someone has a high IQ, they tend to have more autistic traits, which we don't have good language for talking about that yet. Someone who like has more autistic traits than the average person, but doesn't meet full criteria of autism.
Right.
But that was really interesting to me too. And also just kind of made sense. I think because I don't know how you feel about the term gifted. I think gifted is kind of an unfortunate name.
100%.
The struggles of like, I know when I've worked with folks who are gifted, and then if they're gifted and autistic, this is doubly, gifted folks often have a hard time connecting socially with their peers. Perhaps not if they're in a gifted program, but they're often talking at a level that other folks aren't keeping up with. And it was always so interesting because I have worked with several clients, and I'm smart enough that I could understand what they were saying, but I was working really hard to like keep up with them and to be able to be the kind of therapist that could like stay engaged at their level. And it was such an interesting, I do a lot of interpersonal work to kind of realize like, yeah, this person often has the experience of, I don't know if people talk about masking and giftedness, but of needing to like language down, bring down their language, bring down their concepts, bring down how fast their brain is working to be able to connect with others, or they're constantly feeling misunderstood because their brain is working so fast. And so it's been really interesting clinically to see the social struggles that come for a lot of gifted folks and how that, even if the person's not also autistic, which I think a lot of them are, but even if they're not, if they're just gifted, there's still social struggles that come with that.
I want to jump in on that too, because some of the resources you sent us, I was reading through them, and obviously a lot of them resonated. And some of the statements of like, but if you're getting all your schoolwork done, if everything looks like it's, straight A's and coming naturally or easily, you really miss the behind the scenes struggles that are happening academically and socially and emotionally. And I know for me, that was my experience for sure, because I've told Megan this before, but I could get straight A's on everything I've ever done without much effort. And I didn't really put a lot of effort in, if I'm being honest. And because of that, a lot of things got missed because it was just like, Patrick gets straight A's and reads a lot. And like, that's that. And there was never, what you just said, Megan, really stood out to me. The struggle to connect socially with my peer group, especially as I was like getting bumped up into advanced reading and advanced education early on in my life. Like, it was really hard not to feel alone in that.
Mm-hmm. So here's what I feel like. As with so many things, it's always both and, right? It's hard to kind of go either way. I think that advocates for gifted individuals have actually done a disservice. It actually kind of comes back to the fact that the term gifted is just really an unfortunate term that we use, because there is so much, I don't know, like implication about what that really means, as far as valuing, what somebody's contribution to society. And people have talked about how being gifted in and of itself is a deficit. And I have a really hard time accepting that. And you'll hear, I'll be interested to hear what the other guests that you have coming on say about this, because they may disagree with me. But the way I conceptualize it is that, first of all, research really shows, that individuals who have high intelligence have better life outcomes overall. Mm-hmm. More money, more happiness, better relationships, all of these different things. And I actually think that viewing the difficulties that sometimes gifted individuals face through the lens of the social model of disability makes more sense. So, for example, if I'm a student, and again, just going back to the school situation, and I am in a classroom with all of the peers who are my same age, and I have the language skills of somebody who is 5 or 6 years older than I am, right, it's going to be harder for me to find friendships, not because I struggle socially, but because I'm not in an environment where I have the opportunity to actually connect with people. And so then there's this expectation. It's like, well, that person's so weird because they use this, they use all those big words, and so that's a big part of it. Or people talk about, so many gifted people are perfectionists, which, first of all, the research does not. Perfectionism is domain specific. And so we think about gifted individuals as being perfectionists related to academics because that is their strength. And so then they do tend to show that a little bit more. But anyone can be perfectionistic in a variety of different ways. But again, when we look at that through that social model of disability, we can think about the fact that, like, okay, well, are they perfectionists because they've never been challenged and they haven't been appropriately given opportunities to fail? And because if you always get things right and it's reinforced, oh, you're so smart and things come easily to you, whatever, then you don't know how to handle that. And so I feel like if something gets missed, and people are like, so when people want to advocate for gifted education services and they're like, it's so hard to be gifted. It's like, it's so hard to be gifted if you don't have some supports. And it's kind of the reverse. It's not like there's something inherent about being gifted that makes things harder. I mean, I guess again, it's both and. Like, for example, you mentioned
I like how you're nuancing it, though. It's about the context. And I think just having a blanket statement, it's so hard to be gifted. I can see a lot of people, myself included, maybe wanting to roll their eyes at that. Like, totally. Let's talk about privilege. Let's talk about this with more complexity. Like, there's also privilege that comes with being gifted. But you're absolutely right. I see this in family members. I see this in people I've worked with. And so I kind of love diving into this conversation because I kind of love that I'm not gifted. And I'll tell you why. It's because I was not like Patrick. I worked my ass off to get B's and to get occasional A's. And I played the hell out of the IQ cards that I was dealt to get into an Ivy League grad school. But I learned how to learn because I needed to, because I would probably have gotten C's otherwise. Whereas I've seen it in my children when they were younger. I've seen it in folks I work with. For those for whom school comes easy, the ability to grow the distress tolerance of doing things that don't come easy is really hard. And so and I know you work with adults, like launching into adult is not language I like, but the transition to adulthood when you hit the job market and it requires a ton of perseverance, and that's not something that you've learned to do because things have come easy for you, all of a sudden, like job security can be really hard. But it's like, wait, but I have an IQ of 145. How is this matching? This doesn't make sense.
Right.
So yeah, I see the struggle. And for that reason, I'm actually glad I'm not gifted, which
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think when there's just a lot to all of the different pieces. Like there's so much about like, do you know how to do school? Right? Like, and a lot of gifted people don't know how to do school. And there's
I
this
love that. Do you know how to do school? Yeah.
Yeah. And in the DSM-4, it's not in the DSM-5, but in the DSM-4 for ADHD, one of the specific specifications there was that you couldn't diagnose ADHD in students if the academic setting wasn't challenging enough. And so, and they've kind of taken that particular piece away. But yeah, I mean, obviously, if somebody is unchallenged, then that might manifest as other types of behaviors in the classroom. And even now in the DSM-5 and the autism piece, it talks about how social expectations, like somebody may be able to manage socially until the expectations outpace their abilities. Well, so for somebody who's gifted, they can usually mask pretty well. They pick up on that stuff pretty well. And then all of a sudden, what I end up finding is a lot of times these are individuals who didn't necessarily have a language delay when they were young. And so it wasn't necessarily picked up on when they were toddlers. And so then they get to late elementary school or middle school or even adulthood. And all of a sudden they're like, okay, something's not clicking here. It's not coming as easily to me as it does to other people. But all anyone ever saw was their overall cognitive ability, as opposed to those other pieces that got hidden and got missed.
Yeah, like there's a skill deficit, I could imagine. I remember this also with one of my children. When my children started talking at 7 months, was speaking in full sentences at 11 months, had 300 words when she was 1, like just ridiculous off the scales verbal ability. And I remember in my parenting of her, like, because she was so bright, I would forget that emotionally she's like a 2-year-old. So the tendency of like holding her to the standard of how she's talking. And so a lot of that skill development, I don't think I did a good job of like, I've got to teach this, like she's 2, around emotions or around skills of like doing school. And so I think and people, there's been some studies that people will often gauge someone's intellect by their verbal intellect, because that's what's most forward facing to the world. And so I think for a lot of these folks, there is that lack of recognition of like, they still need fundamental skills to be taught to them, because it's assumed, well, because their IQ or the way they talk is 10 years older, there can be those kind of significant gaps that really don't set up people well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you might have a thought on that, but I want to make sure and get time to talk about one thing you said before we started recording that really interested me, was like adults and kind of realizing, I think, education trauma is how you put it. So, and I wanted to make sure we had time to talk about that experience of perhaps like the lost generation of 2E people who are now realizing, oh, wow, my experience of school or perhaps even work, this is part of why that was such a complex or stressful experience.
Yeah. And kind of to bridge from, the conversation that's more directly related with the gifted piece, some people you've probably seen, well, it's around Halloween time now, and there's always those memes about the different costumes, about like, or somebody, well, what are you going to be for Halloween? To the gifted kids, like, well, I was supposed to be a lot of things, right? Like this not living up to their potential, or the gifted kid burnout memes, all of these different pieces. And my very unscientific hypothesis about this is that most of the people who that resonates with are probably twice exceptional people who were never identified. And meaning that they did well academically, they coasted through, they did okay, but there was a lot of other struggle there that was going on. And so in my next book that's coming out in January, it's called Neurodiversity Affirming Schools. And it really is about a systemic change that we need to make in our educational systems for all neurodivergent people. Because going through school on a day-to-day basis, where you are having to mask, where you are constantly being reprimanded for things that are not a disciplinary issue, but part of being neurodivergent, where you are that square peg that is constantly trying to be forced into the round hole, has a lot of long-term implications. And how does that manifest as people grow older? It's like it manifests as I can't, I'm not even going to try, right? Like I can't because it brings up so much overwhelm.
Mhm.
Or it's like the flip side where it's like I'm going to be an overachiever and a perfectionist. I'm going to do all of the things to check all the boxes because it's almost like a hypervigilance as far as what that reaction is to that negative feedback. And I think that sometimes there's a definition for trauma. And I think that, I don't want to take anything away from individuals who have experienced really intense, direct trauma. But that low-level chronic stress of having to be in an environment that does not meet your needs, then you get to an adulthood, and maybe you were masking all of that time, or maybe you weren't, whatever it is. But like the way that you then interact with the world around you, how do you act when you have it, when you're in your job and you have certain expectations that are placed on you? Like, do you have an emotional reaction to that? Are you able to rise to that challenge? Do you have push back against it? Whatever it might be. But we can see those types of reactions in so many different ways. And I think that we underestimate that. And then it also influences people as far as, how they support their own children as they go through school. There's a lot of, I think we really underestimate the harm that our schools do to neurodivergent kids, because it was terrible growing up. It sucked. I hated it. I mean, it's part of why I've gone into the field that I have, because I'm like, this has to be different. It just can't keep going the way that it is. And I see those impacts in myself, every day if you want to look for them.
Yeah. Can I ask more about your personal experience of like,
Sure.
how do you see the kind of long lasting impacts and how it shows up in your life now?
So I struggled a lot during school. I had, well, for so many reasons. I mean, I look back and like I said, Asperger's wasn't in the DSM when I was a kid, but if it had been, we would have looked at it because I was also the kid who was like hiding in the back of the classroom crying for hours when things didn't go the way I expected them to. Like there are a lot of those traits that I see in myself. And so one of the things that I did though, is when I got to college, for example, I graduated in 3 years. I took one semester where I took like 28 credit hours. I had another semester where I took 26, but it was like, I had to prove it. I had to prove to people that I was self-sufficient. I'm also very independent, which again can be a trauma response, where it's like I am not going to ask people for help because when I was growing up and I asked for help, I was told that I should be able to do these things. And if I wasn't doing them, I was lazy. And so now it's like I'm going to kind of step that up. But the stress level that causes on a day-to-day basis is a lot. And so I'm constantly trying to check those things. I'm trying to unlearn those things. And for what it's worth, people who do well academically, if they are gifted, you do have those expectations placed. And then if you don't live up to them, what does that mean about who you are? What does that mean about how you show up in the world?
Yeah. There's so much pressure.
Can piggyback on all of that. And then you add in living in a capitalist society that rewards productivity and achievement. And it's like this constant internal battle to like continuously prove, and completely burn yourself out to no end.
Absolutely. Yeah, the burnout is huge. And I think, we talk about burnout so much and well, I know, Meg and Anna, this is your area of specialization, but I think one thing I would personally love to learn more about just is how many people are experiencing burnout and they are just pushing through because they just don't have really any other choice because I know I've been
Yeah.
there at different times. And I think people always think burnout means that you totally shut down and you can't do anything. I feel like that's maybe a misunderstanding perhaps of how that might show up. But
Yeah, I think that's a great take. Devin Price just wrote an essay on his Substack that I thought was really well done, kind of talking about how the capitalistic system we're in kind of places all of us, like most of us in our relationship to work, is a recipe for burnout, like neurotypical or neurodivergent. The way we've structured society, especially in the States, is one that does not promote like wellness or thriving or balance or harmony or like, yeah. So absolutely, I think that a lot of people are in some state of burnout pushing through. And I think what you've hit on that I really like is when you've been identified as gifted, really, especially IQ, but really in many ways, then there's these expectations that come with that that I think cause someone to like, well, I have to push through because there's so much expectation here.
right. Well, that's just what you learn about yourself, right? Like, and
And it gets tied to worth, I imagine, for a lot of folks.
absolutely.
Performance. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Are you
I
watching? Oh, go ahead.
was just gonna say, I have a sticker on my laptop that says something like "You're more than your productivity," right? But it's so hard to remember that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, especially when that's been reinforced throughout your life of like, this is what makes you special. This is what, yeah, absolutely. I struggle with that too. I'm very much, productivity is very connected to my worth, and I'm working through that. I'm trying to work through that, but don't know that I'll
Ongoing
ever fully get
process.
there. Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious if you have watched High Potential.
I
It's one
have
of my new favorite shows. I watch it with one
Really?
of my daughters who really identifies with the gifted label. And she talks about her IQ is like 160 and it's high potential, but it does a good job of capturing like this is someone with a ridiculously high IQ, but it does not mean her life is easy. It means that she obsesses. It means she can't sleep because she's obsessing about things. So it's fun to see that it's out there. I like that they're capturing, they're not using the language of giftedness, but they're capturing, and she also is coded very ADHD. They're capturing kind of the complexity that comes with high intellect.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, I'll often use the terms gifted or high potential because sometimes, and so it's interesting that they caught on to that. I hesitate. I don't know. I tend to like, I haven't watched it. I've seen the ads for it, and
You might hate it.
Yeah,
you
well,
might
it's
hate
like one
it.
of those things. I'm like, I feel like, but that's with I think any show about neurodivergent characters. I tend to
Totally.
like get annoyed by
I think you'd probably get annoyed by some aspects of it. It's like yeah.
and so, yeah. But I
kind of
think
like, yes.
I think it's helpful to bring awareness about various things to people, and I think that the media is the best way to do that. And if that helps to normalize various labels and diagnoses, I think overall the benefit outweighs the drawback. But you know, it's hard to approach those things because when you're writing a character, well, that character cannot embody all of the whatever traits it is that you're trying to explore. But yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes, that is well said. Well, I think we're about to wrap up. I know you have a meeting here shortly, but is there anything I haven't asked you that sometimes I know I get itchy thoughts in the back of my brain when I'm on a podcast of like, oh, I really wanted to say this thing. Do you have any itchy thoughts of things you wanted to mention that we haven't talked about?
Let me think. I guess maybe, I don't know. No, not, I mean, I feel like there is, but they're not coming to my like conscious mind right now for me to be able to put them into words. I guess maybe
Yeah.
just to also recognize like giftedness. Oh, I know what it is that I want to say. Giftedness comes in a lot of different forms. And I will only just talk about the fact, like one of my little rants that I like to go on is when we talk about identity first versus person first language in the neurodiversity community. And people are saying, especially in the professional world, when you're talking to clinicians or educators or whoever who have been trained to use person-first language, there's sometimes this pushback.
Mhm.
And, no, they're a student with autism, they're a person with ADHD. And what I always, the point I bring it back around to is, there's a group of students who we always use identity-first language. And it's when we're talking about gifted kids. Why is that? It's because language conveys our values. It tells you what we approve of and what is okay and what is not. And I think that the message that we send when we use identity-first language for neurodivergent people who prefer that language for themselves, I mean, everyone can, choose.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's really important to put that into perspective when we really are talking about depathologizing and destigmatizing those labels and recognizing, like, yeah, you can be an autistic person, and it's awesome and it's hard. And it's both and you can be gifted and it's awesome and it's hard and it's both and, like, whatever that might be. And so, just recognizing the value of all of those different pieces and not just the ones that society says are best.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. I hadn't made that connection, but you're right. We've always used identity first for gifted because it's a
Good thing.
It's seen as a good thing.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I love that you help people make that connection when having that conversation. It's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really powerful. That's a great last statement because that is really powerful. It explains the nuance that we talk about a lot on here. And it's a really good, wow, what a good conversation. This was fun.
I appreciate it.
Do you have anything you want to share with the audience? It's that time to share your podcast, your books, or whatever else you've got going on.
Sure. So you can check out the Neurodiversity podcast. And so we focus a lot on, especially for people who are raising neurodivergent kids, like there's a lot that's relevant there, although we talk about a lot of different topics throughout the lifespan. So if you love this one, you might like that one too. You could definitely check out, if you are anywhere like associated educationally, check out our new book. Amanda Morin is my co-author on the book that's coming out in January. Neurodiversity Affirming Schools, Transforming Practices So All Students Feel Accepted and Supported. We're really excited about it. It's available for pre-order now. And you can find me, Emily Kircher-Morris. Just search me up on any of the platforms. I do have a profile on Twitter, may it rest in peace, but I'm not active there. And so anyway, but find me wherever.
That sounds great. And we'll include all of that in the show notes too, so everyone has easy access to everything that Emily just mentioned, because lots of great resources. And Megan and I have both been guests on your podcast, so check all of those episodes out. You have almost like 260 right now, don't you?
I think so. Yep.
It's really well done. I have 160 on my other, and I'm like, damn, how do I keep this moving forever?
Yeah. Luckily, I've got a partner who does all the production stuff, so that makes it a little bit
for sure. Totally. And to everyone listening to Divergent Conversations, new episodes are out on Fridays on all major platforms. Like, download, subscribe, and share. And we will see you next week.